All right, today we're going to have a discussion about pilgrims and kind of, their impact upon America, upon theology, upon the churches, that sort of thing. We talked before, Ben and I, about, the way that the early religious culture sort of set things up for religious freedom and the like, and kind of leading into the early America. It's kind of a big, broad overview, but we were just going to try to just kind of zero in a little bit to talk about the Pilgrims and maybe what distinguished them even more from, say, some of the other early settlements. And if we look at, say, the religious culture of the U.S. today, can we see some trace of them still present in American culture or the religious American culture today? What would you say, like, for as
Well,
like American culture in general,
I don't know about,
or the religious?
we'll have to
uh,
suss that out a little bit, but I think that, you know, uh, genealogical impact, I think it's 1 in 10 Americans.
Yeah,
So I'm included in that because
yeah,
my great, 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 great number of greats grandfather is the John Clark, the pilot of the Mayflower. Not actually a pilgrim, but obviously influenced by them.
for sure.
So,
Yeah, I mean, so if you've got 1 in 10 people that can trace their roots back there, the full 10% of the population who has some sort of family connection to to them some way going back.
right.
So some of that has to be passed on. I mean, I know generations, decide I'm not teaching my children whatever I learned,
Right.
but you know,
Well, more recent generations, they would have called themselves Deepwater Baptists. Um, the group of my family that headed from Massachusetts across New Hampshire into New York, that's kind of the vein that they would have considered themselves Deepwater Baptists, is how they described it. But
okay, deep water Baptist.
I'm not exactly sure.
You don't know what that means.
I'm thinking immersion in some form, but
Okay,
you know,
okay. Like, I guess of making sure that baptism was truly by immersion or something. Is
right.
that the?
I think that's the idea.
Yeah. Hmm. So if going back to the pilgrims, initially, we talk about them coming to the new world, to the Western world, to this end of it anyway, because of wanting to express their religious freedom. We
Right.
touched on this in a previous episode, but what does that really mean? Like, why do they actually leave at that moment? Is it tied to what was going on with the king of England? Is that?
From what I've just recently researched on that, um, yeah, it's James. He is becoming Anglican, renouncing his Presbyterian ways, and the Pilgrims are kind of leaning in that direction.
Yeah,
So they're sort of, in a way, in their viewpoint, persecuted by the king.
yeah,
So, and initially they go to Holland to escape that, but they feel like the Dutch are more permissive. They're a little bit more strict in their viewpoints, and so they want to, you know remove from that.
so the Dutch are too liberal in their application of
Right.
Christian morals,
Yeah. That
basically.
would be the way that they're kind of looking at it.
Yeah, and because James, we talked about this before, but he's King James the 6th of Scotland, and he's Presbyterian,
Completely.
like full on.
Mother is strict Catholic, of course, but
That's right.
right.
Finds out he's in the lineage essentially, and he can be King of England, and so he ditches that quickly, becomes King James the 1st of England,
And the head of the Anglican Church.
and the head of, yeah, because Henry VIII had already sort of paid, he had marked that territory out, right? That
Right.
he was the head of the church instead of the Roman bishop.
But the interesting thing about that is, if when we look at um, James, before James was Elizabeth, right? And Elizabeth is in between Mary and Henry.
That's right.
When Henry breaks away, it's really not a whole lot different than Catholic. It's just he's now the head of the church.
That's right.
Mainly so he could divorce Catherine of Aragon and it would be okay.
Yeah, because he wasn't going to be given an annulment.
Right.
That's
and so there's always this thing with Elizabeth where, was she of legitimate birth, right? There's Anne Boleyn and the king actually married,
right.
and her sister Mary, of course, from Catherine of Aragon, is completely Catholic. When she rules,
known as Bloody Mary.
That's the reason she's known as Bloody Mary.
That's right.
She's going around persecuting Protestants, trying to purge the Church of England, if you will.
Yeah.
And so there's almost a repercussion from that. When Mary goes away, it almost comes back full circle. And Elizabeth actually makes the church even more Protestant.
Yeah.
So it's interesting. She chooses James as her successor, right? And so with him coming in as the head of the Church of England following Elizabeth, that reform,
the momentum was on
Calvinistic Protestant, that angle. That's
the Church of England
heavy.
Was moving. It never. I don't know that it really stopped moving right from that point, because you had the 39 Articles, which had come out before. And
Book of Common Prayer comes out with a little bit.
That's right.
And
that's they're establishing themselves not as much on their leader anymore. It's moving away from the idea that any one person is the head of the church when James takes that role. But James still enforces, certain how do you say that?
Edicts.
Yeah, edicts are, personal vendettas against particular people. He feels like he needs to enforce it in order to maintain some form of religious discipline.
Right.
Even though he quite easily casted off the Presbyterian, robes that he had on, and put on these Anglican robes, and because he imprisons, like for instance Thomas Holy's, the First Baptist Church.
Well, yeah, and you end up the Baptists
pastor
face the same, maybe even more so than what the Pilgrims were dealing with. Because you're expressing something that's even further out from where they're at.
That's right. Baptist theology. I mean, pretty much anything that was outside of the Pilgrims and the Puritans were sort of the fringes of the Anglican Church, right? But anything outside of that, it was
and then you have
still taboo.
Later on you've got John Wesley and the Method, but
that's
that's each one of those is a different take on what do you do with the Anglican Church. And the Pilgrims would be in line with Baptists in being separatist, but they are more they're more of a heavier predestination level, in their theology.
You were saying double predestination.
Yeah, that's what it appears.
Yeah, and so if people are not listening, people are listening, trying to understand what that means. So single predestination is that God predestines particular individuals to accept Jesus and be saved, and then double predestination is that he specifically picks people to be saved, and he specifically picks people to be damned forever.
They would be in an interesting position when Jonathan Edwards comes along.
Yeah.
And he's presenting sinners in the hands of an angry God, and you can actually do something about that.
Yeah.
That would have rang kind of interesting for them, because all along they've been, it's set this way. This is the way it's going to be.
Yeah.
And that offer of hope probably was a pretty good thing.
Think about people like him, like Jonathan Edwards, who he obviously has a huge impact on American culture and life to today, because of it helped to shape America, right? The awakening and revival that spread across the United States, and that does his style, his preaching, his theology. You really can go back.
Oh yeah,
in that sense with him, because he wasn't, the TV preacher type that you would see today.
Right.
He wasn't a Billy Graham or somebody like that. He wasn't trying to get people to come down and do whatever. He was very bland, so to speak. It was kind of plain,
with small glasses, right, looking off the page really
That's right.
closely.
That's right. It's noted that people said that sometimes they couldn't even see him when he was preaching because he had handwritten, hand wrote all of his sermons, and he would read it word for word off
Right.
of the page. So I
Now,
don't know how dynamic he was when he was reading, but we're told he was fairly monotone,
right.
and but then from that small group of people in that church springs this huge revival that
Right.
springs across.
Great awakening. Right.
Yeah, the Great Awakening, and there's tons of people that certain denominations benefit from that.
Right.
You know,
I wonder, and you probably know more about it. That would be the church that he's at would be what we would consider a congregationalist,
that's
correct?
right.
Which, if you follow the history, the Puritans and the Pilgrims, they sort of blend together.
They do.
And that's where that congregational church movement comes in. It kind of has a reformed theology bent, and it's a little open on some of the things that we might disagree on today.
Yeah.
They allow for a little bit more, room in theology on things like Calvinism, Arminianism, and that sort of thing.
Some of the stuff wasn't teased out, I don't think, to the point that it is today. I mean,
Right.
when you have, especially say something like Baptist, which is very new at that time.
Right.
Um,
It's almost simultaneous. I mean, almost,
is.
because I'm not sure, but what year was Helvis dealing with this?
Elvis is 16 ish. It's a roughly the time of the printing of the
Yeah,
James
so we're
Bible.
looking at 1607 for Jamestown. We're looking at 1611 for King James Bible, 1620 for Pilgrims,
That's right.
and
1630 for the
somewhere in
Puritans.
there, Helvis is,
Yeah, it's about the same time.
and Roger Williams is somewhere
Roger Williams is in there.
right in there too. So all of this
It's all new.
is really kind of
They're trying
a
to
storm of theology, if you will.
Yeah, so you'd say then that I'm thinking about specifically what it means to be Christian and people's views of being Christian in America, in the United States, anyway.
Right.
Like the Puritans are connected to the point that they feel this union between, because I don't think that they didn't want to divorce themselves from England
No.
necessarily.
Well, they want to purify it. They don't want to.
That's right.
They don't want to leave it. Like the Pilgrims are separatists. They do want to leave it.
That's right. They wanted the Puritans wanted to fix it.
They want to fix it.
But the Pilgrims had already decided that they were absolutely starting something new.
Right.
Which is different than many movements in the Reformation time period. Right. Because most of them actually wanted to fix whatever they were doing. You go back to Luther, right? He's
just trying to fix the church.
He wanted to fix it. And it's years and years and years of this back and forth of trying to, hey, let's fix some things. It doesn't work out. And a lot of these groups sort of...
Well, correct me if I'm wrong. I mean, Luther, what we call Lutheran is not actually created by Luther himself.
Right. It's his
followers that developed that theology. Probably the same with Calvin, I would assume.
Yeah. Luther essentially just gets to the point that he cuts off that authoritative role that Rome played.
Right.
And he moves more toward a
there's some soul
autonomous church.
Yeah, there's some soul competency with Luther, though. I think you get that the idea that individual personal salvation.
Yeah.
Well,
that's right, because you push up, but then that's kind of in the air everywhere at the moment.
Right.
The idea of, we don't know about all these authorities, right? Kings telling us what to do. Right. You've got revolutions that are going to be happening. All this other stuff is going on.
That is interesting concerning the Puritans, though, considering their value on community. Like that, they call it a congregational church for a reason. That they're it's all about community. I mean, look, the halfway covenant that they come up with later.
That's right.
It's
Whereas I feel like the Pilgrim, the Puritans sort of, that mindset drove, I think, some of the legal framework.
Oh yeah, you get your town hall meetings in that region, New England, straight from those folks and their ideas.
That's right. and including even the first schools. When you have
right.
the first president of Harvard who's fired, for refusing to baptize his infant son.
Well, they felt you needed to be able to read scripture, and
Yeah.
that was the first
I mean, there was literally a
primary
litmus
goal.
test. If you don't really conform to
Right.
what we believe, you can't do that.
Yep.
You can't do that role. And we're, so that formed that kind of that legal framework. But in the background, at the same time, is I think the Pilgrims' legacy in it,
Right.
because their idea that they were going to go at it alone,
Right.
and that to me
They're going to
brings
be
up
different.
sort of the American sort of spirit that's sort of recaptured later.
Almost a bit of the manifest destiny.
It
Almost.
is.
Yeah.
It is that idea that we're going to get this done. We're going to, we can work hard and make this happen.
Right.
Um,
That rugged individualism.
exactly.
Yep.
The Teddy Roosevelt kind of
Right.
persona. I feel like that you could sort of draw a line back to the Pilgrims in that. So it's like there's two streams, coming from that region at the same time
Right.
that kind of overlap one another a little bit.
Right.
Um,
When the Pilgrims were supposed to settle in just north of Jamestown.
which would have been a real contrast, in my opinion.
And absolutely, because Jamestown, they're Anglican, but it's very business oriented, which the things that come from that. I
Sure.
mean,
Yeah, well, today you've got like what 1619 Project and all this other
right.
stuff.
And so, with that in mind, if you've got just to your north, you've got a very strong moralistic, strong in their theology group. That's going to be pretty interesting.
Yeah, you've got some people who are basically cultural Christians,
right,
that are after money, and you've got people who don't care about the money so much. They were worried about, am I doing what God?
Am I doing the right thing? Right.
And those two living next to each other seems to be a problem, but that is essentially the atmosphere that we have even today, isn't it?
Right. I mean, really, really, really boiling that down, you've got a lot of that idea that when the revolution begins, it begins in Massachusetts. It starts in the upper colonies. That there's stuff about Connecticut and all that sort of thing, but that's New England, right? Whereas down further south in places like the Carolinas and Virginia, their opinion of it was different. Not to say that they're not involved in the revolution. They absolutely are. The whole Palmetto thing with South Carolina is a big deal, but their reason for it and their bent on it is a little different. You don't have the Tea Party in Charleston.
Yeah.
It's in Boston for a reason.
That's right.
I think it is that individual nature of that.
Yeah, there's something else about it that you don't get to tell me what to do.
Right. And coming from a religious background, as opposed to Jamestown is sort of the same thing. Like, I'm striking out on my own to do my thing.
Yeah, but it's a business side.
And there is this idea of for the good of the empire in the background there. But it's not religiously motivated. It's monetarily motivated.
Right.
And so it's a different.
I mean, we have that stream still too, don't we?
It doesn't push. Well, I mean, and so later on, you've got Jefferson and Hamilton.
Sure.
You arguing that same point.
Thinking about even later, like the robber barons, even.
Oh, absolutely.
Because as people like Rockefeller, for instance,
greatest donations to the Sunday school board ever, John D. Rockefeller. I mean,
yeah, John Rockefeller. He's, but at the same time, he was not afraid to crush.
Wealthiest man in existence.
He would crush somebody else's business. But also, I am very attached to Jesus.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, it was.
Well, probably one of the greatest philanthropists the world's ever seen.
Sure.
I mean, it makes for an interesting position because obviously he's very rich, he's very powerful, and cutthroat in his business dealings.
Yeah.
And at the same time, when it comes to personal and on that level of, helping people and that sort of thing, he's there.
Yeah. but from that, but he had that. I think he did have that Jamestown
Oh,
mentality.
absolutely. But also the Pilgrims
He did.
mentality.
It was
Yeah,
almost like cognitive dissonance the way that because he would crush businesses and cause them to have to fire all their workers, right? And or put them out of work for a while.
right,
But at the same time, go over here and help these people who are in need.
right.
Like both things were happening at once.
Well, he would come
One
along
man.
and provide them jobs through Standard Oil eventually.
Sure, but you're going to help his company,
Right,
But
right.
and on the other end, you got people like Carnegie and Vanderbilt, people like that.
Also, pretty well-known philanthropists.
They were, and they said that that's what you were supposed to do when you got money,
Right,
But they weren't as personally benevolent, from what I understand, in the way that they dealt with people was a little harsher,
right.
and such.
Well, back to that rugged individualism. To use Carnegie as an example, Carnegie was a guy that rags to riches. I mean, that's his whole thing. He said, "If I can do it, you can do it too."
Yeah,
Basically, um, he just
and that's that idea, right?
right,
That's the Jamestown idea
right.
of doing that, but also the Pilgrims too.
Well, the American
You
dream,
can't
right?
tell me what to do. Yeah,
Right,
and so it almost feels like that the American dream is this sort of weird conglomeration of all of these early settlements.
right,
That you couldn't shake off, no matter how many immigrants come in after the fact,
right,
because culture was already set up to the point that it was an established thing.
right,
And when you got here, people just sort of fit in that mold and they lived wherever their particular persuasion worked,
right.
you know? I mean, now, the way that the world is, it's such a different place. We don't do that. We're neighbors with people who are in other states and it's fine,
Right.
but then it was, you were sort of isolated more,
But you can almost trace some of the ideological views of people today to the very fact that, how does their family history fit into this whole moving around picture? You know, it is interesting. If you look at the beginnings of our political system, you have the Federalists in the Northeast and the Democratic Republicans to the South, and
Mhm.
ironically, some of the better freedom ideas come out of the southern portion
Mhm.
when religiously you would have seen them the other way.
Yeah,
You know,
that's right. Well, I
um,
think it's because of that Puritan mindset
right,
that was present, right, which had kind of established itself in that legal domain in the way that the colonies would be run, and there was such a force.
right.
You know.
Well,
But the Pilgrims are
that direct
there's a lot of
democracy,
truth.
they create the Mayflower Compact is that first governing document, and it's direct democracy. I mean, it's literally direct democracy, and it's that's a noteworthy in terms of American freedom.
Absolutely,
Um,
absolutely.
it is the republicanism that comes out of the South in a way
Mhm.
that maybe alters that a little bit. But then when you look at a group like the Federalists coming mostly out of the Northeast, they're they're not as for direct democracy as they would seem to be. They're more in favor of that federal idea.
There has to be this. Well, I mean, you're coming out of a time period when people are used to living under the rule of kings,
Right.
and it seemed, I think, more natural
Yeah.
to the.
You can't break completely away from that
Yeah, you
thought.
got to have somebody in charge. This
Right.
idea. I mean, I was listening to another podcast recently, and all the name of it now, but this fellow was talking about, um, you know, proposals. I think it was on. It may have been on. I'll think of it in a minute, but it's a history podcast, and this fellow was talking about ideas and that were going to be in the Constitution, like there were as many as sometimes whole committees of presidents, not one president. A proposal that there would be two presidents or three
Right.
presidents, and
Almost a triumvirate like Rome would have had.
yeah,
That was discussed. I'm sure. I'm
yeah,
certain of it.
where you have multiple. So you have like, you know, the top two vote getters would both be president.
Right.
And if you took that in our current election cycle, um, you know, I can't see, you know, Biden, Trump
No,
in the Oval Office
but
together.
but essentially you had Adams Jefferson, which is the same thing.
We did, and we sort of departed from that. And so I think even if they would have installed originally two presidents or three presidents, I think it would have gone away like the the other elements did,
Right.
with Adams Jefferson kind of idea, where you don't have the vice president
Right.
as a
But
different
I
party.
think the bit all along was to make Congress the most powerful branch. Like,
Mhm.
we have
And that's why the idea is about so many presidents too.
right. We have 435 members in the House, 100 members in the Senate, 535. Now, back then it would have been less, but that body, more people, more representation, that's coming straight off of Massachusetts. That, we want the representation. We don't want to be taxed unless we're represented. That self government idea,
Yeah,
you know, um, that's coming straight from the Pilgrims. I mean,
that's right.
it's and the Puritans. I
Sure.
mean, to give them some credit, they are in the similar they're in a similar bent for that.
I mean, they're not that far off from each other. They're just
Right.
to the point of, one group thinks it's too late to fix the problem
Right.
and we're going to move on and do our own. And the other group thinks maybe it's okay if I hang out and fix it.
Right.
That's where they are.
Well, if think of the Adamses in particular, like Sam, I'd be the catalyst.
Yeah.
I'm going to be the catalyst to the change. And I think they do come from a Puritan background, and that's kind of they both studied theology. Ironically, it's kind
Yeah.
of interesting.
Yeah.
So
Some of those guys were very interesting, because I mean, to live, to grow up in that environment would have been, I mean, obviously it shaped their character, who
right,
they were. And so, some of these people, when we look back at them, we see them as sort of the American ideal, or these founding fathers and who they were, almost in the way that the church does with, the church fathers,
right,
looking back at their theology and what they did and why they were important. We look at their writings. We're looking at writings from 2,000 years ago. And today we're looking at writings the same way, 250 years ago, and trying to
right.
understand, what was in their mind. Like, what is Jefferson thinking when he writes this? What is Madison doing?
Or even closer to that, we'll be looking at Clive Staples Lewis and looking at what he has to say. An Anglican, so
That's right.
just to throw that out there,
That's right.
you know.
That's right.
So
Well, so we're gonna sort of take a small detour for a second here, since this is coming out in November,
okay,
right? Thinking about
Thanksgiving,
Thanksgiving.
right?
Um, so what we're traditionally teaching people about Thanksgiving, or at least the way that it's presented. I mean, you think it on the whole is correct, or are there some problems with the way that we?
Maybe a little more of context as to where we're headed with that, but we're
I'm just looking at, like the tale of, they showed up and made friends with the Indians, and everybody was happy and moved on about their business.
feast obviously to
Sure.
celebrate the success of the colony, um, the friendship that they obviously did have with that particular group of Native Americans.
Yeah.
You know, that's present.
Yeah.
You know, um,
I mean, and obviously some of the stuff today is like turkey and everything else, are it's meals that they wouldn't have had.
well,
They ate venison, but
I'm assuming
probably
turkey
some things
was
like
plentiful in the
they
area.
could have eaten turkey.
You know,
But some of the stuff that we have that's, some of the modern dishes that we associate with it, like
right?
pumpkins and things like that.
Cornbread stuffing
Happen.
and
Yeah,
that cranberry sauce,
that's right. That's right.
that sort of thing.
And we think of them with the black hat and the buckle on the hat, and all
Yeah.
that good stuff.
Well, they did dress that way.
They
At
did,
least at
and so
first, yeah.
that's because we look at, say, people like, say, Vikings, and we always depict them with horns on their helmets and all this thing, which when you look back and you think, most people, historians now looking back, said probably didn't have that.
Right.
You know,
That's probably a select individual.
that's right.
That was their style, so to speak.
That's right.
Yeah.
Somebody did that, and then it got applied,
To all.
across to
Right.
all. And so that's what I'm getting at with the whole Thanksgiving idea. So because we have all of these different communities that are popping up along the eastern seaboard,
Right.
right? So you have the Pilgrims who show up and they're struggling. What is it? Half that died.
Yeah, it's like
winter
50 remaining or something like that.
After the first year.
So you're talking about a small community. I mean, and so they would have been absolutely dependent upon the Native Americans that they made friends with.
Yeah.
Um,
It,
they're giving credit to God, of course,
Sure.
which is what we want Thanksgiving to be, I think. For providence, for providing and making sure that they had what was needed. And it would have been a feast on the level, I would say, somewhat close to what we're able to do today. But if that would have been a little,
lasted longer.
it would have been a little bit more of a expenditure for them.
Sure. But it lasted longer also.
Right.
The way I understand, it's not like they just we'll meet at 2 o'clock. And
no, it was like a week or something
exactly.
like that.
It's a process, right?
Right.
Of sharing with one another and giving thanks and all that because they had made it, they lived,
Right.
But yeah, and they would not have lived without the help of the Native Americans,
Right.
because
The soil was tough. The techniques that were used were learned directly from the Indians, Native Americans, excuse me, and just the environment that they showed up in was
the worst timing.
Yeah, it's not Jamestown.
No.
Jamestown's a good environment for what they wanted to do there.
It was, but Jamestown had a problem too because when
Well,
they showed up, I mean, all of them are showing up.
They didn't bring proper supplies.
That's true. Oh, they're showing up on the heels of what was known as the Little Ice Age.
Right.
Right. So particularly harsh winters, and really hot summers at the same time. And I know at Jamestown, for instance, there had been a drought for years.
Right.
Before they even set foot on the ground.
With Jamestown, they show up with the equipment to find gold, but no provisions to stick around.
Yeah, you can't eat money.
Right. And so I would say even Roanoke was probably better supplied than Jamestown was at the beginning. Roanoke disappears, there's the whole story with that. But
yeah,
Jamestown itself, man, many of them starved simply because they didn't prepare.
Yeah.
The Pilgrims are a little bit different.
So what do you think is the difference in that? Because so the Pilgrims show up, they do make preparations.
A goal.
It's what?
It's a goal.
Okay.
Jamestown finding gold, and gold, God, and glory, similar to the Spanish. That was there. That was their plan. They wanted to get rich quick.
Thinking like conquistador kind of mindset.
Very much. And John Rolfe is the one that really saves things there because he brings in tobacco, which would have been illegal. The Spanish would have, basically executed you if they caught you with it. And he brings tobacco in and makes it successful as a cash crop, and Jamestown takes off from that.
Yeah.
And literally, that whole get rich idea, that's still there.
Yeah.
Just a different form of gold in a way.
Yeah.
That they're looking at. To my knowledge, they never find any gold in that region. Now there's stories of gold in Georgia, but
stories of gold all over, right?
Sure.
People are still looking for El Dorado and everything else
right.
for a long time. But so the Pilgrims arrive. They survive because of their association with the local tribe. And what's interesting about that too is that the natives that they talked to, many of them already knew how to speak English.
Right. Is it Samoset, right?
Mm-hmm.
That. Yeah, no, Squanto. Squanto's the one that teaches them.
They already knew it because these people had already talked to.
They'd already encountered English speakers.
That's right.
Yeah,
that's right. A number of them, so much so for a couple of generations of people.
Right.
That people spoke English, already.
Right.
Because I think in our mind we have this idea that they run ashore here and like, wow, look at this, new place.
And they're speaking with hand signals.
Yeah, and they're trying to, you come eat with us, kind of thing. And
Right.
no, they were able to converse with them.
I think some of them it would have been that.
Sure. But
But
overall, you had
there's enough of them that you could have an interpreter,
that
you
kind
know. And I mean, obviously, Squanto is the figure that you lean on there. He's the one that provides the knowledge on the farming. Um, Basically, an alliance where they band together against another group of
Yeah.
Native Americans.
That's right.
Um,
And it seems like the reason that the Pilgrims helped to defeat this other group was because they had become their friends.
yeah, it's sort of a mutual
They were
assistance.
essentially.
Yes,
They were alive because of them, and I think that drove them to want to fight on their behalf.
right.
And I mean, maybe they're in the back of their mind, they're thinking of, well, these people get taken out, they'll be at our door. It
Right.
could have some of that, but we don't know. But nevertheless, they do help them. And so if we're thinking about it that way, now if you slide down the coast, say Jamestown.
Well, they go to war with the Powhatan several times. It's a a rough existence.
Yeah.
There at first in Jamestown.
So their survival. I mean, what do you think it could have? Maybe it could have gone differently there in Jamestown. As far as like uh, Native American relations and what happens, and the success of the colony in Jamestown. Like, if you compare it to what happens with the Pilgrims.
Yeah, I mean, you could almost see Jamestown going one or both ways. You could see it be worse
Yeah,
than what it was. I mean, you've got legends of things like John Smith coming in and he who doesn't work doesn't eat,
that's right.
and things like that. And that shores up the colony to some degree. But it's not until Rolfe brings the tobacco in that there's any success there. And that, I believe that's 1617. So that's like 10 years into the colony,
Right.
Before it's actually starting to see some success. Where the Pilgrims, after the initial 50, you know, they they start to prosper.
Yeah.
And it's not because of agriculture, which the South, agriculture is going to be the big thing. Up in the North, they realize that, hey, agriculture is going to be able to help us subsist, but we've got to find something else.
Money.
Yeah, we've got to find something else as a livelihood.
Yeah.
And so they develop all these cottage industries and things like that eventually make them very profitable.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. It's such a different atmosphere, the North versus the South at that moment, and the way that things were developing. But I do, as we stated earlier, all of that sort of got meshed together and became the American ideal.
Right.
I think.
Well, and
As people moved west.
that conflict, though, North-South politics, religion, you name it, that's still present.
It is. It never went away.
It never went away. It just changed its character a little bit.
It's almost a setup for the Civil War before we were ever united.
I mean, Jefferson and Hamilton's politics, you can see that all the way to 1860.
Because Jamestown, I mean, if you're planting tobacco in
The beginning of your cash crops,
1619
is when the slave ship shows up, and
that's right.
I believe it's Portuguese slave ship.
And they needed them to propagate it to make any money in the way that they were doing it.
The English weren't really involved in the slave trade until that point. And at first they were going to resist it, so you see that Anglican, that religious background wanting to resist that slavery, but the economics won out.
Yeah.
And
it was money.
Right.
Yeah. And so it's such a different atmosphere in that way. But and that split, that line sort of continued on that trajectory, because the North, it wasn't only the Pilgrims that had these cottage industries. Those cottage industries turned into actually bigger industry.
Well, right. You end up with the textile mills and Lowell and you name it. But even before that, if you think about the slave trade, how many slave ships had Boston on the stern.
Mhm.
It's kind of an interesting thing because you look at the later abolition movement, things like that, kind of growing out of Pennsylvania in that area, but Massachusetts up in Boston, where we kind of think it should be, it's not because a lot of profits going on
Well,
from
you've got
that.
a harbor there. You've got facility. It's more money. It's just it's money winning in every
Right.
stage. It's
And so that's your Puritans that,
right.
we're thinking about there. Um, Amazing Grace.
Yeah,
Um, he was a slave trader,
that's right. John Newton.
and that's that all within that. From 1619 on, that's when that starts. The English weren't even involved before that, so you know, um,
It's really it's that colony sort of egged it on, right? I mean,
right.
it's like if it wouldn't have been
Well, that colony spawns the other colonies. You know,
exactly.
because Pilgrims 1620. That's a year after the slavery starts down in Jamestown.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. So there's already slaves present before the Pilgrims arrived.
right,
Okay, so I was thinking about we are saying that the Pilgrims were supposed to be like just north of Jamestown.
right.
I'm wondering, the impact that their presence would have had on
Okay,
Jamestown.
going back to that idea.
Yeah,
Okay,
like if they went where they were supposed to go,
so just kind of thinking about that. If they had settled where they were supposed to be, you're looking at the next peninsula up, so to
Mhm.
speak. So you have the York and the James River there, and if you keep moving up, you end up in Washington,
Yeah,
and you end the Potomac. So kind of interesting that that's
that would have been
yeah,
the Pilgrims' home.
right.
You know,
And instead, you end up with more of the Jamestown style all the way up into Virginia, and then Maryland. Lord Baltimore actually proposes it as a Catholic colony, an escape for English Catholics too.
yeah, because so Jamestown doesn't really have a northern border essentially because there isn't another
Well, no, it was all called
colony.
Virginia at that point, right? I
That's
mean,
right.
they start calling it New England
But if
with
you
the
have that
Plymouth,
cutoff there, with the Pilgrims being just north of them, there's at least something to sort of restrain that Jamestown, maybe that Jamestown
right?
mindset.
Well, and I'm not sure on the years on this, but you've got New Amsterdam in the middle.
Mhm.
You've got the Dutch in
Yeah,
between. So
true. New York.
interestingly enough, the Pilgrims had experience with the Dutch before, so that's kind of a neat
Yeah,
idea there,
yeah, and having to leave there and come all the way here, and then there's the Dutch again,
right?
right? You can't really escape them.
Right,
Yeah, it's funny. Because I feel like that Jamestown model is what created. Obviously we said it helped push England into the slave trade business
right.
anyway, and that
Well, yeah,
ushered in.
following Jamestown, you're going to see the Carolinas come along, saying built in the same way. Maryland, really, kind of the same thing, even though it was founded as a colony for religious purposes. It it still kind of turns into that business, just tobacco. I mean,
Yeah,
that's what's there. Um, Delaware is part of Pennsylvania, but they are when we get to the point where we're talking about free and slave states,
yeah.
they're actually a slave state. They're on that peninsula in that area. Um,
It's almost it's just.
Pennsylvania is the breaking line,
I think
really.
Jamestown is, in the aftermath. Then it seems is kind of a story of an unrestrained greed.
Yeah,
You know,
that's
really,
the
that's kind
side
of the root of all of it, isn't it?
the side of the American dream where we're looking at getting wealthy
Yeah,
quickly. That's there,
yeah.
you know.
Get rich quick stuff,
Right.
and slavery helped to usher that
Well,
for
at
some.
least that's the way they saw it, right? I think initially tobacco with slavery was probably profitable initially. Later on, they start to realize that
It didn't work.
doesn't work. But then 1793,
That's right. They started trying to dump their slaves.
you get Eli Whitney's cotton
Um,
gin. And cotton is so profitable that it turns it around.
Yeah.
And even if they had realized, if we simply pay a wage for these cotton workers,
Right.
we'll make even more money.
Yeah.
But they're making money. So it's kind of like the oil field today, right? The oil field's making money so fast that they're constantly sending pipe back and forth to retread it and things
Yeah.
like that. And if you dump something that's worth several thousand
They'll
dollars
never
overboard,
reinvent the
they're
wheel
not going to spend a bunch of money to go and find that because they're losing millions of dollars by not
because
drilling.
they're not doing it at that moment.
Right.
So the longer time that you're not growing tobacco, you're not making more money or whatever.
Exactly.
That's just
So the
keep
more
going.
cotton fields you can plant, the more cotton fields you can harvest. That becomes profit in their eyes.
Right. Right.
And so that is the catalyst for the increase in slavery in the United States.
Yeah, it was a number of circumstances that sort of led to that because they, the intention when the Jamestown settlers get there is not, hey, let's get a bunch of slaves and we get there and they'll do all the work for us.
Right. I don't even think agriculture is on their brain when it first starts out. I
Yeah.
think they were looking at maybe some
It
subsistence
was
farming.
rich quick from the beginning.
Right. It was let's go and find gold. Let's go and establish a colony so we can reap the benefits.
Would if the Pilgrims then, I go back to that again, if they would have settled closer there, do you think that their agricultural prowess would have affected Jamestown such that they would not have been searching out to find, hey, let's grow tobacco? Or was that such a force that the pursuit of money that it was going to probably
So
be bound to happen anyway?
Rolfe already has the tobacco plants by the point that the Pilgrims show up.
That's true.
So
1620.
that's already begun. Now, as far as it being successful, that takes some time. But I think the Pilgrims' influence, we have to look at the fact that they probably would have been affected as well. And one of the things that causes the industry to boom in the North is the idea that their soil is poor.
Yeah.
So if they had been given good soil, we might be looking at something completely different.
Yeah.
Um,
They may have been more agriculture up north, and if they would have been successful with agriculture, they may have been involved in it as well.
Either that, or and I kind of see them as possibly being your breadbasket farmers, where they're providing food, not cash crops, but more wheat and barley and the sort of things that you would need to
Stuff that's
survive.
grown, say, in the Midwest today.
Right. Well, and then that's an obvious correlation because
Yeah.
you've got them moving over.
Yeah.
So
Interesting. So we've kind of been all over the place, but this was again a random conversation
right.
about what was happening at the time the Pilgrims were landed, and sort of the aftermath of that. We kind of try to keep them as that focus, but I think we're going to call this discussion, and see you guys next time.